Today is November 11th, 2014. I'm Adrienne Falaise, and it is my honor to be interviewing Michael Learned for the Archive of American Television here at her home in Beverly Hills, California. So let's start right at the beginning. What was your name at birth?
Michael Learned,
And when and where were you born?
Washington, D.C.,
What year?
1939.
Where did you grow up?
Oh, that's a big question. I grew up, we lived in New Jersey during the war in Hackettstown, New Jersey. And my mother, there were three of us at the time, three girls. I was the oldest, and my father signed up or went to sign up to go overseas about 4 times, and they wouldn't take him because he was still in college and doing graduate work, and he had 3 children. But they finally took him in 1945, and he fought over in Germany, and we lived in Hackettstown during that time. Then we moved to a beautiful 21-acre gentleman's farm in Connecticut, which was a paradise for children. So I grew up there. And then when I was 11, in 1950, we went to Europe and we traveled over on a freighter. There were 12 passengers, and it was supposed to be a 10-day trip, but it took us 3 weeks because of the rough seas. And we had water in the cabins. It was pretty scary, but somehow my parents, I don't know how they did it, because there were by then there were 1, 2, 3, 4, Michael, Gretel, Susie, Sabra, and Dorrit, who was still in diapers, and 2 cats and a dog, and a big Dodge station wagon. And this on this freighter that was supposed to capsize, but luckily didn't. And I keep thinking back and thinking, how were my parents so able to keep us from being as terrified as we should have been? Because it was really a rough. You couldn't see the swells were so high you couldn't see anything but water. It was as if we were in a submarine, you know. And somehow I don't remember being terrorized, but it was a pretty scary time. So. And then we landed in Bilbao in Spain and traveled all through Europe. I was out of school for 6 months, and we ended up in Austria. You want my life history? You're getting it.
That's great.
We ended up in Austria in a tiny little beautiful village in St. Gilgen was the name of the village, on a lake, surrounded by mountains. And we were all put into the local school. We didn't speak German, but we learned it very quickly. And so I grew up there, and then when I was 12, I was sent off to boarding school in England. Shipped off is more likely. And that's where I grew up.
Wow. So what were your parents' names, and what did they do for a living?
My father's name was Bruce Learned, and my mother was Betty Hooper Learned, Elizabeth Hooper Learned. My mother was a housewife, should have been something else. She was a very gifted, talented, creative woman. And my father, when I was little, when we lived on the farm, he farmed the farm. And it was quite a time. We had people coming out from New York for weekends, you know, that worked for Esquire, and all this very witty kind of Dorothy Parker sort of thing, combined with a Walton's-like kitchen where we all sat around the table. And it was an interesting childhood, to say the least. And my father, actually, after that, he worked as a newspaper editor for the Stamford Advocate for a while. And then when we were in Austria, he was working for the OSS, which is now the CIA. But I didn't know it at the time.
Wow.
I didn't know until that's what we were doing when we were traveling. I thought we were just stopping in nice places to go swimming and stuff, you know, in France and Italy and Rome. But actually, I think my father was making he was a spy. Mm. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think what he was doing in Austria was training, resistance people in case the Russians came all the way in to Austria and Germany. And it was still occupied at the time that we were there. There were Americans and British and Russians. So it was an very interesting childhood, because after being there just a few months, I was speaking fluent German in dialect, And so the American soldiers would come in, and I looked a lot older than most of the European kids because they were deprived during the war. So they were a lot shorter. I was more developed and a lot taller. I looked about in the Austrian equivalent of 18 or 19, when in truth I was 13. And so I could hear what all the American soldiers were saying. And I remember feeling very, very embarrassed by their behavior. And then I came back to the States when I was just turning 15, and I went to high school where a lot of the kids were going off to join the army, and I suddenly understood that there was no preparation for these kids to suddenly be sent to a foreign country where nobody really welcomed them. And so I was fortunate in that I began to see both sides of it.
What traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
A love of reading, good manners, because if we put our elbows on the table, we got whacked with the end of a knife. And respect and consideration for others. I think my parents did role model that for us.
So you mentioned several siblings. How many siblings do you have?
I have 5 younger sisters.
So what was that like growing up as the oldest?
You should talk to them. I think I felt somewhere that I was responsible for them, which they're not all too grateful for now, but I've given that up. And it was, when you're the oldest, you're sort of the one your mother tends to lean on to help with the younger kids. So in that respect, I think it was a little difficult, but then you also have respect as being the oldest child. So everything always, if I ever do write my memoir, it's going to be either in retrospect, because in retrospect, some of the worst things that happened to you turn out to be some of the best things that have happened to you. And in retrospect, it was good to be the oldest. And I got the best of my parents. I did.
What were some of your interests when you were growing up?
Ballet, like every young girl. I mean, that's all I ever wanted to do, was to be a dancer. And I remember all I wanted for Christmas was toe shoes. And my mother always gave us wonderful Christmases. And I didn't get toe shoes the Christmas that I had begged for them, please, please, please. And so we opened all our presents, and finally my mother said, "Would you please pick up some of those wrappings under the couch? Everything's a mess." And I went to pick it up, and there were the toe shoes under the couch. And that's a Christmas I'll never, ever forget.
So is that what you wanted to be when
I
you
never
grew up?
wore them either, because my ballet teacher said, "You shouldn't be wearing toe shoes until your bones have formed." And I was only 10, I think. And so, but I just had them. It was wonderful.
Did you want to pursue ballet professionally?
I went to school from Austria. When I was 12, I had a sort of breakdown, I guess, again, in retrospect. I know why, but at the time, I just shook and cried all the time. I'm sure part of it was hormonal, but my parents took me to the doctor, and she said, "I think this girl has, in this little village, she doesn't have peers who are interested in the things that she's interested in," even though I put on shows in the local meadow, and we did all that stuff, But so my mother took me to audition for the Sadler's Wells, and they said I was too tall, and I had flat feet. So that was my first major disappointment in life. And then we found another school called the Arts Educational School in London, and I went there for half of a term, and then from there I went to a boarding school in Hertfordshire, the same school, but a boarding school. And that's where I won a drama cup. Although I was not a drama student, I was a ballet student. And the teacher said, "Michael, you're not really a very good dancer. I think maybe you should become a special drama student." So that's how that started. And And I cried through the entire time I was at school. I just cried. She's, Michael, could you cry a bit more quietly, please? You know, I was a very emotional kid.
What didn't you like about the school or the area? Or...
It's a beautiful school. It's a Rothschild mansion. And was actually in the basement, there was a bell that had King Charles II on it, you know, when the bells ring for the servants. And the training was wonderful. We had a dance class every day and a drama class every day. Mime, speech, scene study, Shakespeare. And then we had ballet, Greek, tap, modern, you know. And then in the afternoon we had academics. And I just cried through everything. But I think I felt I was homesick for my family. And they were in Austria, I was in England. So I didn't get to see that much of them. And I think probably today I would have been sent to a shrink, but back then we didn't do things like that. So it was just a hard time for me emotionally. And I took my husband and my son back to see the place, and I looked around. I thought, oh, how fortunate I was to have been here, and what a shame that I was such an unhappy child that I couldn't appreciate it at the time. But my memories of it now are very good and very grateful. You know, like so many things in life, you know, I look back and think this gave me a career in this place, and the teachers probably felt as trapped as I did. So it was mostly homesickness, you know. You want to go away to camp, and then you get there.
But that's where your interest in performing started to grow?
I think so. I mean, it was a great surprise to everybody that I won the Drama Cup. It was just a local within the school competition, but and I fell in love with acting then, because it was a perfect place for a rather rigid child to get rid of stuff in a safe environment. And I think to this day, I think a lot of actors feel, at least I feel sometimes, that it's a place where you get to experience things. You get to live many lives when you're an actor, especially if you really get into your work. So I've been Cleopatra. I've been in Noel Coward. I've done all that stuff, and I've been a farm wife on the Waltons, and I've experienced many lives in one lifetime. So it's a great privilege, and it started all at that school, the Arts Education School. And somebody told me that Julie Andrews also went there. I'm not sure she did. I don't have facts on that, but somebody told me she had. It was a very good school.
So is that where you completed high school, at this boarding school?
No, I then came back to the States, and by then I wasn't interested in academics. I was a terrible student. I just didn't even try. So I think I went to a year in Washington. My parents were living in Georgetown at the time. And then I went to Stratford, Connecticut, the first season, the Shakespeare Festival. And I was a rather robust flower girl and peasant. And I was in the conservatory. And that's where I met my husband, Peter Donat, and we were married when I was 17, and I wasn't pregnant. Swear to God.
So you actually did an apprenticeship with the Shakespeare Festival, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that.
There was a wonderful man named John Burrell, who was the most articulate person I have ever known in my life, really, that's all I remember from. I mean, we did the sword fighting and we did all the things that you do. We did monologues and at the end of the season. But mostly for me, what it was I met the father of my children there. And it was a chance to be on stage and to experience what it was like to actually be performing. Mm-hmm. I think we were even paid some little, $12 a week or something. And I don't remember too much about the whole thing because I then went back to England after that as a day student in London. And so I don't remember too much about that summer. I just remember it was wonderful. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Did you watch a lot of television growing up?
None. We were not allowed to have TV. So And in fact, my father caught me once in the garage reading a true romance comic book, and snatched it out of my hands and said, "Why are you reading this crap?" And I said, "Oh, it's romantic." So he came back with Emile Zola's Nana and said, "You want romance? Read that." And handed it to me. Must have been about 10. I think I'd stolen the comic from my best friend down the street. But so we were not allowed to watch TV. It was not in the house. We would go every Friday night to my friend's house and watch Howdy Doody or whatever, Hopalong Cassidy or whatever was on in those days. You know, TVs were about this big. And it was magical to me. I loved movies. I loved television. I loved all that stuff. But we weren't allowed to have it.
Did you go to a lot of movies?
Whenever I could, but we lived so far in the country, we had to be taken. And Esther Williams movies. I got to meet her. I mean, June Allison, all those. I was sitting at a table with Jane Russell, June Allison, Esther Williams, Margaret O'Brien, and Teresa Saldana. I don't know how she got into that group because she's a lot younger. They were the most gracious women and funny. They'd all just come from a book signing of a famous hairstylist. I can't think of his name. And so they were dissing him and all the stories they were telling him. And to sit there and listen to these icons that I had grown up with. Of course, I didn't tell them that. But, and they were just fabulous. They knew all about some of my work, which flattered me no end. And there I was sitting at the table and they all looked exactly the same to me. And dear Margaret O'Brien, who's probably one of the nicest women in the world. So it was quite a treat.
So you said you were married at 17 and you'd met your husband in Connecticut. Did you stay in the Connecticut area when you were married?
What happened was I met him that summer of my apprenticeship at the Connecticut Shakespeare Festival. The first year it started with Hurd Hatfield, Christopher Plummer, Roddy McDowell, and Raymond Massey. Who else was there?
It's an impressive group.
I'm trying to think of the women, and now I can't because they were so overshadowed by the men. I had a big crush on Raymond Massey. I must have been a very sick girl. I needed a father. I had a father complex, I guess. And Chris, of course. Everybody has a crush on Christopher Plummer, who is divine. So after that, Peter and I were sort of an item, and my mother said, if you go back to England and finish school, when you come back, you can marry Peter. So I did. I went back to England as a day student. I stayed in digs there, and that was a very interesting time. I had a wonderful affair with an older man, and came home and told my mother, and I think she thought, well, I better marry her off real quick. So next thing I knew, my mother said, "Do you still want to get married?" And I went, yeah, I guess so. I mean, I was 17. I look at a 17-year-old now and I think, oh, what were my parents thinking? And next thing I knew, I was getting married. And I have 3 wonderful sons. And so I don't regret a minute of it.
So what was your acting career like at that point? Were you set on being an actress at that point?
You know, I don't think I had any other options, really. I didn't have a college education. I hadn't really finished high school. And Peter was an actor, so in that was the 50s. So I immediately, he came in one morning and he said, we were living in a little apartment on West 44th Street, just across from the actor's studio. And we were, like a 3-floor walk up, and it was a tiny little apartment. And he came in one morning and said, I sat on the edge of the bed, and he said, "I think you should make me breakfast in the morning." And I went, "I should?" And so from that moment on, I really studied up on how to be the perfect 50s wife. If there's anything I regret, it was that, because I became obsessive about cleaning and catering to my husband. I would turn the bed down at night and lay out his pajamas like a personal servant and stuff like that. He never really asked me to do that. I just thought that's what being a good wife was about. And, I think that whole 50s thing was fraudulent, really, because it put the man way up here and the woman way down here instead of two partners. And it's not real. And I think a lot of women of my age who went through that period, not all of them did. Some of them were very independent and didn't buy into it, but I did because I was so young. And there's a lot of resentment underneath that, you know, that you have to work through and come out on the other side of. Mm-hmm. So that's what I did for about 15 years, and then our marriage fell apart, and we both moved on. And he's still. We have a very good friendship, and he's still with us, and married to a fabulous woman, and we have these beautiful sons. They're not children. Mm-hmm. They're old. My sons are old.
So did you pursue any theater work around this time?
Not really. I think I had pictures, you know, and I had a made-up resume on the back, which most when you're just starting out. And when I got into the whole 50s thing, not to complain, but because his career was the career, and I was there to support his career. Mm-hmm. And so I wasn't really that... I've never been ambitious in that way. Now, I suppose I'm more ambitious than I ever was, because it's not ambition. It's not to be the top. It's not any of that. It's to do the work. And when you have children and a husband and other things, it was never my first thing. Mm. So I guess I pounded the pavement a little. I did a couple of off-Broadway shows. But it was never my primary thing at that time.
You actually did some Canadian television in the 1960s.
I did. We moved to Toronto, and Peter would go up, Peter Downat, who was my husband, would go to the Shakespeare Festival in Stratford, which is probably one of the great theaters in North America, one of the top great theaters. And we'd take the playpens and our high chairs and pack our car up and drive up to Stratford because I was living in New York then. We were living in that apartment on West 44th Street, and we'd pile in, and that was always a happy time for me when the kids were in the car, and my husband was in the car. I knew where he was, and we'd be going to Stratford, and we stayed in these little houses, and it was a wonderful summer. For all of us. Peter loved the work, and I loved being there. And then we moved to Toronto, and that's when I started doing Canadian television. The kids were a little older by then, mm-hmm. and they did some wonderful things on the CBC. It was a lot of the classics, which was all done with television cameras, not film. And the way they moved those cameras around, and the way they rehearsed us, and the costumes were magnificent. The makeup was fantastic, and it was quite wonderful.
So your first role was actually on the Canadian Anthology Series Festival. Do you recall that?
I think it was Three Sisters.
Yep, it was.
Yeah. It was Three Sisters with Kate Reid and Franny Hyland. I can't remember who directed it. I don't know if George McGowan directed it or Eric Till.
I don't have it here.
Anyway, George McGowan was married to Franny Hyland, who was one of the top actresses in Toronto at that time. And Eric Till was also, a hummingbird. Out the window, there's a hummingbird.
Very nice.
So Kate actually said, you should play Irina. And I had done it in New York, off-Broadway, which is the youngest sister. So it was a big break for me to do that. And I don't think I was any good, but it was wonderful to work with them. Everything was so much more casual in those days. It was there was not the angst that there seems to be today.
Mm-hmm. And what were your first impressions of television production in general? Did you find it fast-paced or?
Well, in Canada at that time, because it was tape, we rehearsed. So it was like doing theater. The only thing was sometimes we'd have to run from one studio to the other, and we'd be changing crinolines or whatever as we ran from one studio to the other. And Eric Till, I think I did Doll's House with him and another one I can't remember the name of. But, he was so adept with these cameras and he would tell you exactly, okay, you're going to be on camera 1 for this thing, and then I'm going to be over shoulder for that. And so you knew technically exactly where everything was going to happen. And the actual shooting was fast, but the preparation for it was more time. It's not like now where you get on a set and you've never met anybody and you take off your clothes and get into bed and play a love scene, So in that respect, you felt prepared.
Mm-hmm. In 1971, you were in the Noel Coward play Private Lives in San Francisco. Tell us about that.
Oh, that was such a wonderful experience. Private Lives. It was interesting because I was going through the separation with Peter, and of course it is about two people who really love each other and are not together and then rediscover each other. So in some ways it was very personal to me. And Francis Coppola directed it, and Francis, forgive me, but we were such, when you're young and you're in the theater, you really do think you know everything. And so we didn't really think Francis knew what he was doing. And he would disappear every weekend and come down to L.A. to do some editing on some film. And Paul Chenard, who was co-starring in Private Lives with me, he and I would redirect the scenes because we thought we knew better than Francis. And Francis would come back, and we'd show him, and every time he'd say, "That's horse shit. Go back and do it the way I told you." And of course, he was always right, and he was always going for the truth of the scene. And oddly enough, the more truthful we were, the funnier it was. And it was a joy to be in that production because people adored it. And when I think we fulfilled what Francis wanted. He was driving a little rusty old, my memory of it anyway, is it was a rust-colored old dilapidated VW. And, his method of directing is he was such an easy person to work for. And he would just say, nothing's happening. Let's go get some sushi and come back later. And we'd pile into his little VW and go off to a Japanese restaurant and drink a little sake and come back and then loosen up and things would start to happen. I loved working with him. He's a lovely man. And of course, it's a beautiful play. It's about a lot of things. It's not just a stylized comedy. It's much deeper than that. So it was wonderful. I'm trying to think of some. It just so happens that the movie he was editing was The Godfather.
I was going to say.
That kind of settled things for me in terms of arrogance.
You trusted him as a director then?
Well, we didn't even know it. It came out after.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, he called me one day and said, I'm doing this movie. It's called Apocalypse. And you'll be the only woman in it. Would you be willing to do it? I said, "Oh, Francis, please, thank you. And of course, by the time 2 years later, when he actually did it, it was a totally different thing. And I think a photograph is in it floating down the stream. But at the time, I said, "Please save me, get me out of this television series, please." Anyway, my memories of Francis are very warm and grateful.
So Private Lives actually played a part in you getting cast on The Waltons. Is there a connection there?
You probably know better than I. Maybe, I don't. The story I heard, and I did not hear it from her, but I went to Bill Ball, who was the artistic director at ACT, and I said, "Am I coming back next season?" Because I had played Cleopatra that season and Private Lives, and both were quite successful, but the theater was very successful anyway. I mean, it had a great subscription. And I went to Bill and said, "Am I coming back?" Because I was going through this divorce with Peter. And he said, "Do you want to come back?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I'll let you know." And I thought, oh my gosh, I better get my butt down to L.A. and learn the freeways because I would always get lost when I was going for an audition or anything. And I would arrive with sweat in my shoes, you know, that I'd be such a nervous wreck when I got there. And so I did that. I came down, I stayed at the Hollywood Lamb Motel on Ventura Boulevard. It's not there anymore. There's a different motel there for $12 a night. And I'd come home, and Mary, who was the manager, would be tied up in the office because somebody would come and mug her. When you're living so near a freeway entrance, terrible things happen because they can get away. So poor Mary would be tied up, and I'd untie her and say, "Are you okay?" And she'd say, "Yeah, one more time they mugged me." And
So we were talking about your audition for the Waltons.
yes. Well, there I was with Mary at the Hollywood Lamb Motel. I had a Raggedy Ann doll and a bottle of bourbon, and that's about all I had with me, I think. And my Volvo station wagon with a frozen orange juice cap in where the gas thing is, because I couldn't afford a new top for it. It was one of those stick shift. It was a great car, really. And my agent had been bugging me. He'd been calling me, and David Graham is his name, and he'd been calling me in San Francisco to come down and audition for this thing. And again, with the arrogance for a nervous, frightened, shy doormat, I certainly was arrogant as all get out because I said, I'm not a character actor. I just played Cleopatra and Amanda in Private Lives and blah, blah. And he said, you got to come down and try out for this. And I kept saying no. So when I was actually down here to try to learn the freeways, he said, that part is still open and I want you to go see about it. And no. And I couldn't get out of it. So I went and met all I remember is I was going through a lot of emotion. You know, I was getting a divorce from a man I'd spent half my lifespan with and 3 kids. I didn't know how I was going to support them. And so I was, again, a wreck. And I remember this long table with all these guys sitting there, and one of them saying, and I didn't dress I was dressed in a dress with my hair up, and I wasn't trying to look like the part or anything. And he said, would you be willing to do a screen test? And I said, of course. And I went back to the motel, and then I got a call saying they want you to test. And I said, okay. And all I remember about the test, because I was hungover, and I'd been crying all night, was I remember Ralph and Richard. I remember the director, I think it was Bob Butler, and he was very nice, but he talked kind of jive talk, so I didn't really know what he was saying, and I didn't know, I'd forgotten that you have to hit marks, and that there are microphones. You know, I'd been doing theater, so I'd totally forgotten, and I was sort of dazed anyway, and I don't remember, they wanted a woman with long red hair in her 40s, and I was short blonde, shorter than my hair is now, blonde, and I had just turned 31. So I didn't even invest in it emotionally because I didn't think I had a chance. And I didn't want to do television anyway. I wanted to do theater and stay in San Francisco. And so I remember getting on the set, and Bob Butler sort of talking to me and going, And then I saw this young man with a mole here, a very attractive boy, I thought, and this guy in overalls, and it was Ralph and Richard Thomas. And God bless them, because then I was home. It was like I have 2 actors, and I zeroed in on them. I didn't even know where the camera was, nor did I care at that point, but I could zero in on them. It was a very small little scene, and I think, I made a suit for him or something. I said, here, John Boy, and he puts the suit on, and he comes out, and I go, you look real good. I mean, it was real simple. I think Dinah Shore once, on her show, showed me my audition, and it was no big deal. It really was. And so I did the scene with them, and I left, and I remember a production assistant running out after me and saying, what's your phone number? What's your phone number? And I gave it to him, And then that was it. I didn't even give it another thought. I really didn't. And 4 days later, I was taking a shower. The phone rings. Wrap a towel around. Go out, and it's my agent saying, "You got the part. You're the mother of America." And I went, "Oh my!" I went, "Oh no!" And that was the beginning of a whole new life. But I wasn't at the time. I wasn't prepared for it. I didn't really have any full understanding of what it was going to be.
Had you been aware of the TV movie at that point, The Homecoming?
No, I had not seen The Homecoming. But they told me Patricia Neal had played the part, and I thought, well, why aren't you using her? She's the best actress in the world. And that was another reason I didn't want to come down and try out for it, because I thought we were completely different types. You know, she's dark, and she has this great, wonderful, deep voice, and I didn't think that I was like that, and I wasn't. And she and I became good friends. She was such a gracious, wonderful, great lady. And I said, you know, "I'm so grateful you didn't want to do the series." And she said, "I did want to do the series. They didn't ask me." But they had told me that she didn't want to do it. So that put her way even higher in my esteem, because I thought how gracious of her to have embraced me as a friend and as, you know, rather than seeing me as a competition. She was great.
So how was the character of Olivia Walton first described to you?
As strict, unrelenting, doer, really. Maybe they didn't use the word doer, but in the Homecoming, the movie of the week, which I think is a classic, she is rather eccentric in a funny way, and in the beginning that's what we tried to do. And then there was one scene I remember, which I think it's when John Ritter, who played the Reverend, when he was new, when he was just coming to Walton's Mountain, the new Reverend, and Olivia has the kids all dressed up in their Sunday best, which are woolen suits, and it's a very hot day, and there's this pitcher of lemonade sitting in the middle of the table, dripping with cold, and the kids are sweating, and she's making them sit there and won't let them have any lemonade. And the Reverend is late, and they're sitting and sweating, and it's awful. And finally, John Walton comes in and says, "This is ridiculous," and takes all the kids to Drusilla's pond and throws them in the water, and they have a good time. And I remember going to Lee Rich, our producer, and saying, "Lee, this is borderline child abuse, really." And we all decided that Olivia could have her values and be, a little rigid in whatever it is she believes in, but she has to, if you're going to see her every week with her kids, she has to be a little softer. So we softened her up a little bit.
So did you have some input into her character?
A lot. We drove the writers crazy, and we drove everybody crazy, I think, a little bit, because they were gracious enough to give us input, and we did. And sometimes we were not always as tactful as we could have been, I guess. But really, it is a lot of pressure to do a 1-hour show. You work long hours, long, boring hours, some of them. I don't mind working hard, but to be bored is just sucks the energy right out of you. And so if you're called at 7 a.m. and then you're sitting around until 1 or 2 or 4, and then you work until 11, it's a long, enervating day. And, I finally said, I think when I got a little bit of power, I said, I refuse to pour another cup of coffee. I will not pour any more coffee, because they would have me in these scenes. They wanted the mom in the picture, but they wouldn't give me anything to do except say, "More coffee, John, more coffee, John boy, more coffee, Grandma, more coffee." So I said, "No coffee." So it became kind of a joke, and the writers were wonderful about it. Mm-hmm. They had other people pouring coffee. "More coffee, Mama?" So they were terrific, and they put up with some, but not too much. We were a pretty regular cast. We were pretty good. We loved each other, and I don't think you can fake that kind affection and chemistry. You really can't. And I think it came across in the show. And the first 5 years, the writing was magnificent. And I'm so grateful to have been part of that. I just came back from a Walton's fan club reunion. And, you know, the heartfelt gratitude and emotion from so many of those people for that show is humbling. I hate to use that word, but it is. It's humbling. It makes you feel, oh my God, I've been a part of a life. Not me personally, but my character. And when people say, you taught me how to be a mom, I always say, no, I didn't. Olivia Walton maybe, but not me. I was just the conduit. And I usually drop a swear word somewhere in there so they really get it.
So the kids that were cast in the TV movie, The Homecoming, were the same kids that were in the series. Did you feel kind of an instant chemistry with them when you came on, or were there any challenges to coming in to a group that had worked together already?
They never made me feel in any way. The kids were wonderful. And no, I never felt I never felt like an interloper. I was inexperienced with film. And so I remember, you know, every now and then you just get inspired by something greater than yourself. And I remember saying to the crew, I haven't done film in a long time, and I haven't done that much, and I'd appreciate any help you can give me. And they were just fabulous. The crew, we were like a family. So between the crew and the kids, we were great. The only problem was Ralph and Will Gear, who insisted on mooning us any chance they got. That was the only problem.
They were the practical jokers.
I saw more of their rear ends than I ever wanted to see. And they were terrific. I would run screaming into the set.
We'll talk about them more in a little bit.
Okay.
So you were billed as Miss Michael Learned when the show began. Do you know what the reason for that was?
I was billed as Miss Michael Learned because my name is Michael, and I was an unknown, so they were afraid people would think, why is this woman kissing this child? And then the name Michael Learned is there, and that was why it wasn't on my part, or I have to be billed as Miss Michael Learned. It wasn't that at all. It was mostly because of my name.
Is there a story behind your name, Michael?
Too many martinis, maybe? I don't know. My father said, had you been a boy, we would have named you Caleb. But as you were a girl, we decided to name you Michael. I said, okay, thank you. I always called my father Bruce. I never called him Daddy or Dad. And my mother said, we named you after Michael Strange, who was a poet who was married to Eugene O'Neill. So that's it. All my sisters have unusual names. I'm Michael. My next sister was Gretel, Susie, Sabra, Dorrit, and Philippa. So they're not exactly your run-of-the-mill names.
So on the Waltons, you had rotating billing with Ralph Waite. Talk about that.
I didn't have anything to do with the billing. I didn't ask for it. I don't know if my agent worked anything. I don't think he did, really. I think it was just... I remember the sound man, Bill Flannery, came up to me, I think on the first season, and said, your character is going to be the heart of the show. And I thought, are you out of your mind? All I do is pour coffee and say, time for bed, kids. And then what happened? Pass the salt, please. But, so I think it maybe evolved, the billing evolved. But Richard was the star of the show. He was the star. And then Ralph was cast way before me. And then I do want to give credit here to a woman named Ethel Wynand, who I think is responsible for me getting that part. She never told me because she was much too elegant to tell me this. But I was told by another director who's a friend of mine who said, you know, Ethel Wynand went to bat for you because, and he was telling it as a sort of joke, but he said, Fred Silverman didn't really want you, and Ethel Wynand had been, because she used to come up to ACT and see all the shows that we did. And, I mean, a real casting person. And apparently she liked my work, so she went to bat for me. And after that, whenever Fred Silverman would say, well, I don't know about this person, she'd say, remember Michael Learned. So I owe it to her, really.
So let's talk a little bit about the premise of The Waltons. Describe what it was about.
The premise of The Waltons. Family. Really, it's that simple. I think in the first season they had a lot of guest people and guest stories, but I think they realized pretty quickly that what people really wanted to see was the family. So there were, of course, people that influenced the family or how they reacted, but basically I think it's about family. And I remember once going to Bangladesh, and they all had seen the show. I thought, Bangladesh, people have seen the Waltons. Family. That's what they all said. It's about family. We all relate to family. And I think the first 5 years are really a history lesson for kids. I think it should be shown in schools because Earl dealt with the Dust Bowl, the Depression, of course, gypsies, all kinds of stuff that back in the Depression days. It gives you a sense of America back in the 30s. And I think as the show evolved, as do so many shows, it got a little, you tend to fall in love with yourself a little bit and run out of ideas. And so it sort of, as the kids got older, it was not the same show that it started out to be.
What was the tone of the show like?
People think it was soft and saccharine. It really wasn't in the beginning. I mean, Grandma was not soft and saccharine, and Grandpa had an eye for the ladies, and the Baldwin sisters drank too much, and John Walton as well, and Olivia was a little rigid, and but somewhere underneath that was the sense of love and that things could be resolved. It was an hour show that had a resolution at the end. And I think we all long for that. And I can remember my own life, when I was in turmoil in my own life, I'd be sitting on the porch shelling peas or whatever, getting ready for a scene and thinking, God, I wish my life was like this. So I think it's to this day, people are telling me, it's such a comfort to watch the show. And I don't know if it would ever go in today's world, unless it's a classic. So in that sense, maybe. And people are watching it with their children. But it's a legacy, and Earl Hamner has left a legacy. And because I'm doing this interview, I suppose I am too, having been part of it. So it's an honor.
Do you recall filming the very first episode, the pilot, The Foundling?
I recall the pilot only because Ralph and I sat and laughed through the whole thing and said, this will never go. And there was some guy in a bear suit, and John Boy had to shoot the bear, and I can't even remember the first one. I only remember that I thought it was terrible and that it would never fly. And then miraculously, I think the critics really kept the show alive. The critics were so kind to it. And suddenly, within a year, we were on the map. And it was a huge adjustment. It's a huge adjustment to suddenly have people. But for me, actually, because I didn't look much in my own life like Olivia Walton, I wore a hairpiece in it, and I had short hair. And they did dye my hair red for the first few seasons. And so people children recognized me, but a lot of people didn't recognize me. So I had the best of both worlds in that I was in a show that was very popular, but I wasn't, I could go to Walmart and shop if I wanted without anybody stopping me or bothering me in any way. And most of the people, whenever they did, were very kind and nice. I don't know what it would be like to be a superstar. I would hate it. I would hate it.
So let's talk a little bit more about your character, Olivia Walton. Describe her a little bit for us.
Well, Olivia Walton. She wasn't me. But Ralph and I worked very hard to give to for the world to know that these two had a great sex life. They slept in the same bed. In those days, that was innovative. That show was innovative in many ways. To have us sleeping in the same bed, and obviously we enjoyed each other physically. Ralph would pat me on the butt, and you just had the feeling that they had a good sex life as well as a good relationship, and that they were partners in life. She stood up for herself when she needed to, and I guess I learned some things from her, actually, because I tended to be a bit of a doormat at that time. My now husband says, John says, I didn't know that woman, but I said, well, she was there, and there's a shot of Cammie, who played the little Elizabeth. There's a shot of her on the toilet. I mean, when did you see that back in the early 70s? Never. All you see is her head and her feet, but she's sitting on the commode. And what else? Ellen Corby coming back and being disabled from her stroke, which she truly was. Those were all new things. And even having the continuity that the show had, even though each show sort of had a resolution, the show also still had a continuity to it. So it was innovative in many ways. And it's so astonishing to me that whenever CBS does a retrospective of the top shows of an era, we are never mentioned. I'm stunned by that. And it hurts Earl Hamner's feelings. I called him the last time. I said, I can't believe they're not mentioning the show. But I don't know why. Maybe because it's an hour show, and I don't know.
Was there ever anything that the writers gave you for Olivia that you disagreed with?
Yeah, and there were times I thought, that's the trouble with doing a series for too long, because sometimes you think you know more than anybody else about your character, and you're not open to maybe your character acting out of character, which is what we all do in life. But I did go up to Earl once and say, Earl, didn't your mother ever make a mistake? And he said, no. I said, didn't she ever... My mother used to sometimes think I did something that I didn't do, and then I'd get really upset and I'd want to run away. And so I think my struggle with them was often, can we not have her be so perfect all the time? Can we have her make mistakes? Can we have her be a little judgmental? Can we have her not always... handle things perfectly? And that was my biggest struggle.
Did you ever get to meet his mother, who the character was based on?
I did meet her, and what Earl said that time was, I said, didn't your mother ever punish you for something you didn't do, or didn't she ever, and he said no, and then he said, well, sometimes she wouldn't speak for a week or two, and I thought, okay, well, that tells me something. But I did meet her. She was very gracious, very nice, and I just went past the house. When I did the Waltons fan club reunion, I went past their house, which has now been totally renovated, and a lot of people make pilgrimages to that house in Schuyler. So,
did you bring any of your own personal experiences to the role?
Oh, a lot, and also some of the story ideas were mine. There's one when Olivia gets a perm and it turns out horribly, and I said, I know every woman in the world will relate to this, and she goes around with a kerchief on her head. And, so they went along. They were very open to suggestions and ideas, and very gracious.
So let's talk a little bit about production on the Waltons. You mentioned the schedule was a little brutal sometimes.
I think it is on any hour show. Actors who do hour shows work. They earn their money. They really do. Because we were working with kids and animals, there were limitations, so sometimes we adults would have to wait, and there were no cell phones back then. So even though I only lived 5 minutes from the studio, there were times when I would just be hanging around for 6 or 7 hours before I actually worked, and I'd be in makeup, and I hated that part of it. And we didn't have fancy dressing rooms in the beginning, and so we were in these tiny little trailers, and it was hot and just boring. Boring is the worst thing in the world. And but now I don't have kids. I don't have anything pulling on me. I wouldn't mind sitting in a little trailer and reading a book, but back then, all I could think of was I promised the kids I'd take them to the dentist, and I couldn't do it because it rained, and they're going to shoot inside in the sketch. You really are owned, and they pay you good money to own you, but you really are owned by the schedule. And the schedule will change constantly because this happens or that happens, and they quickly have to change things. But I know I'm sounding ungrateful, but I am not. I'm so grateful for that show. It saved my ass, and it put my kids through school, and I have friends for life. I lost Ralph recently, and it broke my heart. I loved him dearly, and I love all the kids who are now middle-aged, and so it was a blessing in my life.
What was the atmosphere like on the set?
Ribald. Dirty jokes, cussing. At first they said, you can't swear. I have a filthy mouth. I try not to, but I do. So I've let myself drop a few on this interview because that's who I am. I'm sorry. And actually, I'm trying not to. It's just second nature to me. My mother could say the F word and it sounded like, pass the tea, please. So I grew up with it, and it's just part of my vernacular. But the kids, we tried very hard not to swear around the kids. We tried to be good parents to those kids. And, of course, the kids were worse than we were. So, and they were just, they were never bored because they were so alive. And Will Geer was never bored because he always was writing poetry or doing something, and Ellen was painstaking about her work, and she would rewrite things and get very fiery about stuff. But we were like a family. We had our spats and things, but it was never unresolved. It was never, nobody ever went around not speaking to anybody. We had a lot of fun. And in retrospect, we had more fun than I realized we were having at the time. But I've seen some of the outtakes, and I think, my God, we had such a great time. And then it was hard on guest stars because they would come in and they wanted to rehearse, of course. And we'd be cracking jokes, and we were so bored, and we knew our characters inside out. So we would try to be good, but we weren't.
Were there ever any censorship issues with the show?
I'm sure there were, but I don't know what there were. In terms of censorship, that was something the writers had to deal with, or the producers. I really don't know if they did or not.
So you'd mentioned the series creator, Earl Hamner. Talk about working with him.
Well, I don't know what to say about Earl, except that he would be obnoxious because he's such a nice man if he didn't have such a wicked sense of humor. But I threw him into therapy, This is my claim to fame, that apparently I wrote some not very nice comments on one of the scripts, and I didn't give it to Earl. I gave it to Lee Rich, but Lee Rich sent it to Earl, and it upset Earl so much that his wife said he was going to quit the show. And his wife said, don't quit the show, get therapy. So he told me this. I'm telling this story on myself because Earl said, I want to take you out to dinner at Orso's. I was doing a play in New York. And I said, oh, I'd love that because I love Earl. How could you not love Earl? He's just the best. And he took me out to dinner and he said, I want to thank you for getting me into therapy. And so I said, well, you're very welcome. What happened? And then he told me. And of course, I felt terrible. We are very dear friends. And I don't think Earl... he wasn't a showrunner like they are now, so he didn't really have any more power than we did. But of course, he was the heart of the show. He was the heart of the show, and it was about his family. So it was difficult for him because he knew everybody. They all knew who he was writing about, and so he tended to be a little too nice and a little too soft, and everybody, so. That was really our only struggle with Earl was, people are going to hate it. If Elizabeth is saving up her money to buy a doll and she gets the doll and the homeless guy has a daughter who needs the doll and she runs up and gives him the doll, everybody's going to hate her. What you have to do is see her want to give the doll and she can't part with it. That's human. And Earl would usually go along with it.
All right, let's stop there to change the tape.
Yes, because I